Good day, everyone. I am delighted that you are able to join us for our webinar this morning on a very important topic. For those of you who are not familiar with the Forum for World Education was formed about 2 years ago to bring together business leaders, policymakers, education practitioners, and researchers to talk about what we need to do in order to improve education, not only in our individual countries, but across the world, and especially for our most disadvantaged students. It is my pleasure to introduce our topic for today. If you were a participant in our March webinar, you know that we are looking at ways in which countries responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Last month, we talked with the head of the IEA about a study they had done about the actions that people were taking in the very initial months of the pandemic. Today, we're focusing on a report that was created by the OECD in collaboration with the World Bank, Harvard Graduate School of Education, and 100 to look at how learning continued during the pandemic and what lessons we can glean from those activities that would help us as we move forward in improving the future of education so that we're able to address challenges that arise unexpectedly as the pandemic did and still carry on a robust and effective education system. I think that what you will find in the report, which is How Learning Continued during the pandemic, published by OECD, is that many countries across 5 continents responded in different ways to the pandemic, and we can learn from that some of the strategies that were most effective and that therefore should be continued. So on today's webinar, we are very fortunate to have a presentation by Stéphane Vincent Langren, who is the the executive director of the assistant of the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, and is also a senior analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he leads work on the digitization of education and also has been involved with a project with 24 countries on fostering and assessing creativity and critical thinking in education. As we all know, those are 2 critical competencies that our young people need to develop. So at this time, I would like to turn to Stéphane's presentation, and I will talk again at the end of it, where I will just introduce our discussants, and we will start to have a live discussion about the report.
Hello, my name is Stéphane Vincent Langren. I'm Deputy Head of Division and a Senior Analyst at the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation. And it's my pleasure to address you today and to talk to you about some of the things that we've learned about the COVID pandemic. I'm going to talk about innovations that happened during the pandemic, actually how education continuity was assured, reflect a little bit on the challenges and the drivers of all the different innovations and actually what made them possible, what made them fast, and then talk to you about the first emerging evidence about what happened during the pandemic based on statistical studies that were actually carried out in a few OECD countries. And then I will finish with a few concluding remarks on that. Let me start with initiatives and lessons from the pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about is actually really based on a book that we have just released, How Learning Continued During the COVID-19 Pandemic, and which brings together 45 education continuity stories or case studies that we have gathered during the first wave of the school closures during the pandemic. So it's a joint effort of the OECD, the World Bank, Harvard Global Education Innovation Initiative, and 100, a Finnish organization. And really that was started by when Andreas Fleischer, Jaime Saavedra, and colleagues came together. And so that's a book that I had the pleasure to co-edit with Cristobal Cobo at the World Bank and Fernando Reimers at the Harvard School of Education. What we've done was really to try to document governmental and civil society initiatives and really to make sure that learning would continue during the crisis and to support families, to support teachers. And so you have a variety of different types of innovation that were put forward during the crisis. It's a book that covers a lot of different countries, not just OECD, but really has, in fact, every continent is covered, and which gives us an idea of what the digital education infrastructure was in some of the countries. So I think that's an interesting point, because that will be one of the things that we will want to work on now, how we can expand, think about what the minimal digital infrastructure for countries should be. And so that's really something important that we have learned during that time. Let me start with a few country examples, 4 examples coming from different countries. Actually, it's 5 examples because I'm going to present 2 from Colombia. So in Colombia, one interesting example is what the government in the city of Bogota did. They've put in place a learning at home program, which is a multimodal learning platform with, in fact, it's a web portal which had a lot of created resources. And then one expanded to education, TV, radio broadcast, a lot of print sheet, and also game activities. An interesting aspect of it was that there was always a support office on pedagogy and technology. Also, it was a multi-stage initiative, which started with really an emergency response based on a web portal and actually an attention to nutrition, as it's very important, obviously, for students to continue to have good nutrition to be able to learn. So it started with a grab and go model in schools, one that we have seen also in a few different countries. When that part was done, actually, they moved on to a second phase, which actually expanded this web portal to TV, radio, social media, realizing that, in fact, online was a great thing to give, but in fact that it doesn't cover enough of the population. And so they also changed the model to an out-of-school nutrition model where they provided coupons to be redeemed in some markets, or they provided vegetable baskets in rural areas. And finally, the third phase was really trying to address the gaps, make sure that people which didn't have enough connectivity would get more connectivity, negotiating internet rates, zero rating models, and providing devices to people, but also to distribute where all these things were not possible, physical supplies, worksheets, games, etc. So that's a very interesting approach that was taken. Another one, which was also done in Colombia, is actually, and it's an interesting initiative because it's a civil society initiative done by teachers. So it's done by Teach for Colombia, the organization that belongs to the Teach for All network. And that really involves students in the design, production, and broadcast of audio podcasts, so lessons that were done for radio or podcasts and that were distributed through 2 different channels, WhatsApp and local radio stations. Interesting way is that, like in many of these old technologies like TV and radio, they managed to make it more interactive by actually having WhatsApp interaction with teachers, and that's really a model that we have found in a lot of different countries. In Nigeria, here that was a governmental initiative called Edo-Based at Home. So here that's actually moving a web platform to a mobile-based learning platform, also with a lot of interactive audio lessons, which were aligned with the Nigerian or the Edo curriculum, digital self-study packets, etc. And also providing support by teachers and trying to involve the parents as part of that. So here, that's really a shift from an online platform to a mobile platform. And here again, a zero rate agreement was negotiated with a telecom operator. And there was a lot of support from teachers via WhatsApp, text, and also on the web platform, the original one. What they tried to do is to have engaging content on different subjects, and that was released all the time, but also actually to make sure that there was support when there was practical problems appearing, and that there was automated interactive quizzes that were provided. We moved to a totally different type of solution, and just also to give you an idea of the coverage that and the number of ideas that were implemented during the crisis. In the Netherlands, there was this platform called Students Helps Pupils, which is a public-private partnership, something which was subsidized by the Dutch Ministry of Education, and where the idea was basically to give free or very cheap online tutoring for middle and high school students, and provided by the university students. So basically, that was a matching platform that would select the best higher education student, that would train them to tutor in a specific subject, and that would actually match them with students who also applied to receive some help from them. So that's really something that initially was designed and existed before, but really to prepare the final high school exams, and that was extended to all the secondary education level. And actually interesting, some of the challenges they had to overcome was basically to get it known that they existed, but also getting teacher support, which was sometimes a bit reluctant, and also to overcome some of the limitations of the technology, that because they had to actually go up very quickly. So there was a little bit of AI, for example, in it, but it's not necessarily as fancy as the matching platform that we may know in different for different subjects. Finally, another interesting initiative is Wide Open School. So this one, I've chosen that one because it is a purely private sector initiative with a partnership between for-profit and non-profit organizations. Basically, it's really publishers that have made their resources available for free, at least part of their resources, not all of them, obviously, and that were curated by age and by use, so how, when, and how you should actually use these types of resources, and all that by a family trusted organization, Common Sense, that is actually used in providing advice to families on what movie to watch for what age, what books are appropriate for different age level, etc. So here, there was a mix of old and new resources as well, because they mobilized also a few famous celebrities to collaborate with teachers, for example, NBA basketball players, meeting with a physical education teacher, and to provide ideas about exercising, how they brought together actors to talk about drama with English teachers, etc., to actually also make it a bit more attractive for the whole family. Here, the idea was all these resources could be either used by teachers, but also they could be used directly by the families, by parents. And one of the interesting features is that they really help them to organize their time and have balanced activities between learning, academic learning, game, exercise, fun, etc., etc., and managed to actually do that through a very simple platform. Because one of the big difficulties in that case was to overcome the IP, intellectual property issues, and they've managed to actually reach agreement that would normally have been totally impossible. The way they've done it is just by allowing the users to get out of the platform in terms they were clicking on content, so that in fact then the IP of the host platform would apply. And the other thing they've done is to have a gradual deployment, so start with something simple and enrich and improve as we go, which is also one of the models, I come back to that many initiatives have taken during the crisis. So what are the kind of learning solutions that were provided to people? Well, in fact, all over the world, governments have provided a variety of learning resources. It's very rare. I mean, there were a few cases when nothing was provided, but overall, I would say that most governments have tried to provide learning resources. And the way they've done it was to use multi-modal or multi-channel solutions that cover different types of technologies. So here you can see on this graph that from primary to secondary, it was a lot of mixed solutions, mixing online, TV, paper, etc. But you could see that, you know, in a few cases, in a few countries, it was just online platforms that were provided, or sometimes just TV, education, etc. So in many cases, we had this mix of different things. And why? Because one of the things that people tried to do was to adapt to the technology that was available within countries. So if everyone has online, then online was fine. But in many contexts, in fact, the use of radio, smartphones, social network channels, etc., were one of part of the solution. And this is really also one of the interesting things that happened during and that we've learned from during the COVID crisis. Teachers contributed a lot to all these different learning solutions. One example is in Finland, where, you know, the national TV, Yle, developed a distance school using some of the videos and material that they had. And for that, they actually asked expert teachers that they had identified through on Facebook to actually come and help them to select, to help them to design a format for all these different types of resources, and also to give examples and advice on how these resources could be used by teachers to actually teach about them. So in that case, it was all online and the resources were not broadcast on TV, which wasn't the case in many other countries. Teachers developed and created a lot of resources for students as well. You know, I've mentioned Teach for Colombia, where these radio or audio podcasts were designed by teachers, and actually how they involve the students in the design and the broadcast of them as well. We could find some similar types of initiative in Chile, in a few other places. In England, we had the National Oak Academy, where teachers brought a lot of lessons, video lessons together, and things that would actually cut across the curriculum, and that could actually be used by some of their colleagues. And in India or Brazil, also they asked expert teachers to record part of the curriculums for video lessons as well. You know, so here teachers really were a strong part of the development of these solutions. They were also part of the professional development opportunities, because one of the big challenges was obviously how teachers would shift from face-to-face, in-presence teaching to online. And in the case of primary and secondary, this was absolutely not something that they had any habit to do. And so, for example, one example is how the EdCamps were turned virtual. So that's examples in Ukraine and in the United States with Teacher Promise, for example, where there was virtual camps on how to teach online, how to use all these different tools. And so it was really sharing across teachers. In Belgium, that was the same through a platform called Class Cement, where people could actually share ideas, communicate, have fora, and also post a lot of new resources to help each other. One of the things perhaps we also should keep from the pandemic is actually the role of parents, which parents are obviously, the main educators of their children, but here actually they were playing a role in the academic learning of their children that was kind of much stronger than usually. So here in early learning, that was something that was very strong. So in Brazil, Maranhão, for example, they developed a kind of curriculum where instead of targeting teachers, it's targeted parents and trying to help them to support the learning of their children and showing them how they could actually turn everyday activities into a learning activity. So basically, how when you are going to wash your clothes, for example, you can actually use it as a way to develop literacy and to count some of the different items, how you can actually exercise the vocabulary of your children in different ways while playing with them, or while doing the dishes or while doing different types of things. So that's really something that was developed by pedagogues for early learning, and that was brought to parents through radio. But it went also beyond early learning. In India, for example, in Madhya Pradesh, they developed this where they had a multimodal solution for education continuity. And one aspect of it was this application, this mobile application, Top Parent, that was actually helping parents to keep their children engaged, and was going from grade 3 to from 3-year-old to 13-year-old children. And finally, I've already mentioned wide open schools, and how some initiatives try to help parents to balance the learning, the academic learning, with other types of activities of the family. There were many challenges as well that had to be addressed, and that's one of the things that we have learned during the crisis. One relates to the inequity in the learning conditions at home. When people are at school, we tend to forget that when they're back at home and if they have, housework, etc., their learning conditions are quite different. And that's why school as a place is actually one of an equalizing factor. But of course, the housing conditions remained what they were, and people, had to struggle more or less depending on those. Another aspect is nutrition. We know that, you need to not to be hungry to be able to work and to learn, and that this has a very huge impact on the learning. So one of the things, for example, that in the state of Sao Paulo, they did was to provide a cash allowance to the full family, and not just limit the nutrition to the student. And for that, they mobilized also private funding. So that was a public-private partnership where private funding was actually added to an existing cash allowance that they were giving. In the US, the free meal model was extended to the whole family, thanks to a legal decision. And many districts that we've seen have actually a grab-and-go model where people could just go to the school, take some food. And here again, it was not just for the child in that case, but for the whole family as well. Second problem that we've realized is obviously the digital divide, the fact that devices and connectivity were not more missing than we expected, and that's true actually, and I'm going to get back to that, in OECD countries as well as, of course, beyond where we expected it most. So that in a few countries like France, Korea, the US, UK, one of the things that people had to do was really to loan equipment, sometimes to give them away, and actually to work a little bit on the connectivity as well and provide people with this type of devices. Many countries where the mobile has the strongest penetration and it was easier for people to use that type. One of the things that happened was to have a zero rating model with telecom operators, allowing them to watch all the TV or connect or download education resources for free, and so that it wouldn't actually be a burden for them to learn. And I would say that overall people have really concentrated on the technologies that were the most available to their populations in general. And that was really one of the first diagnoses that people had to make. Second thing, and that's really something that all of us did, what we realized is that there are a lot of learning resources around, and actually perhaps more than what we expected. And so one of the things that everyone did at the beginning was to recommend learning resources, to see which were the ones that were available and which were the ones that were adapted to the curriculum. And so navigating this abundance, and some people say this overabundance of learning resources, was one of the challenges of educators, teachers, schools, and governments, generally speaking. Ironically, this is also true in languages where there is so much English, Spanish, and perhaps because of a lack of taxonomy for all these learning resources, which made them much more difficult to locate than what you would have expected. I mean, the one that you would want to have that match your curricula. So that was one of the big difficulties, and perhaps one of the things that we should think about going forward. Second aspect was really adapting the curriculum. So, people actually kept on the curriculum in many cases, and that was a good thing to do. Try to continue to learn new things, but try to do a little bit less. And of course, one of the other things was to provide sometimes students with special needs. So like in Turkey, where they've developed an app called I'm Special, I'm in Education, for people with dyslexia or visually impaired, etc., making sure that they could continue to learn during that time, or adapt or make sure that people who have a different language at home could also be assisted by their parents. And so, for example, in the United States, in one of the districts that we have covered in the book, one of big effort was made on providing Spanish-speaking resources to families, so that actually the parents could actually help their children also to learn during that phase. In Uganda, there was the use of radio to make sure that the curriculum could also be aired in minority languages across the country. Another point that was really challenging is actually to maintain people engaged in learning. That's something which is pretty difficult to do when you don't see people. It's already difficult to do when you see them, but so when they are remote and you don't really see them, then that's really one of the big difficulties. I think the first solution in most countries was to keep teachers in charge of their students, so make sure that they remain responsible for their classes, and so that in fact they could follow up on them, etc. And this is something that was sometimes very much strictly implemented. Sometimes even there was some pushback because the burden was felt as too big on teachers, but it's something that's a model that we have seen almost everywhere, which is not one that is actually obvious. You could have imagined that online teachers could actually cover a lot of other students, or etc. Second thing people did was to try to have engaging lessons and activities. While that, it's easier to say than to do, but it's something that everyone has put a lot of effort on, making sure that, that would be the case. And always, as I've mentioned before, supplement them with interaction with teachers or sometimes with peers. And here using a lot of different types of technology, from texting to WhatsApp to webs, etc., as well as in a few cases, virtual classes, for example. There was a strong focus on social and emotional skills. And so we have the specific programs, examples of specific programs that really targeted that aspect. But I would say that overall, when the comprehensive solution that were put in place included a social and emotional dimension, and they also made sure that they would actually try to follow what was going on in the whole family. One of the difficulties, obviously, was to, and a lot of effort was put into that as well, was to communicate about the existence of all these different learning platforms and all these different resources, because we know that just providing resources does not mean that they are going to be used, and so that was a very important aspect. And I would say another one is really the continuous improvement and feedback loop that were actually provided through monitoring, with people tracking on what they were providing, trying to get feedback, improve, and get feedback and improve, etc. So that was a very important aspect as well. Final one was to provide incentives. So here, the interactivity also relied in quizzes, assessments. In some cases, they were actually rewarded and recognized, as was the case in India, in Nagaland, where they trusted actually the students to send their assessment and would give them some kind of rewards. Or another way was in Saudi Arabia, where they actually maintained the exams and used the proctoring solutions to make sure that happened. And obviously that puts a little bit of pressure on people. And because here, interestingly, in many countries, and actually in most OECD countries, they let go of the exams during that period of time. Or let's say, no, they didn't let go of the exams because people still got grades, etc. And final exam results, but they let go of the exam as an institution where you had to go to an exam center, etc. So it was a lot of teacher-graded types of exam that at the end of the day. So why were all those innovations possible, and how could they be so quickly implemented? Well, it's really because all these different organizations built on existing capacity. First, they built on existing infrastructure, and I've mentioned the fact that how many of those solutions were actually using something that pre-existed and that was actually expanded to a new usage. Like, for example, in Mexico, they have a very long-standing TV education that actually was initially more for high school students, and they have expanded it to other levels of education and expanding the coverage. It's also about the use of existing human competencies, and it's really built, part of the leadership and the strong leadership that happened was to use the competencies that people had, the knowledge that they have, and the network that they have to actually make it happen. So building on the knowledge networks and partnerships that pre-existed was something which is very important as well. Many of the ideas came from what others were doing, the knowledge of partners, sometimes in different countries. So the Teach for All network is a very interesting one. The radio programs I have mentioned were an adaptation of what one of the Teach for All organizations in Africa had actually developed, which they quickly repurposed to their context. But of course, one of the important aspects of the success was that they could actually go to these colleagues, this friend that they had, to actually see what it took to implement it, get advice, get started with some of the resources. In some cases, past projects. So here, for example, in Latvia, there was this TV platform that they had put in place, which was an idea that they had envisaged before, but that they had never actually brought to fruition. And here that was the context. But of course, it was possible to do it very fast because they had already done a lot of work on it, and they really just had to adapt it to the current situation and to launch it in this work. They also the work with constituted networks. I've mentioned the ideas in Finland, for example, of these expert teachers and this group of teachers that they actually worked with. Partnership is another reason that made it possible, and with a lot of public-private partnerships, public-public, private-public, private-private. So we know the importance of partnerships for innovation. In normal times, we perhaps don't see enough of it, especially the public-private ones. But here there was really a lot of goodwill, obviously, that made it happen, but which really showed the strength and the possibility of those different types of partnerships to happen. Third point is really the attitude of the mindset that the best is the enemy of the good. So here there was a real willingness to go for something which was initially suboptimal, and that would then become better and better over time. So I think that's something we may want to also keep for the future, but because in fact there was this time pressure, and that was one of the big difficulties, and there was actually this idea that we don't have time to go for the best, so let's really go for something that's going to work and that we're going to improve as we go. And that's really something very important that made it possible. And lastly, and I've already mentioned it, there was a lot of monitoring and refining of all the different types of solutions based on feedback. Like in Peru, for example, they have a very interesting ways of doing surveys, of taking a lot of feedback from the teachers, the families, etc., to improve the platform that they actually provided, which was a multimodal solution between the spirit of the ones I have already presented. Interestingly, perhaps it is government that have not monitored as much as what you would have expected, because there was actually fewer quantitative and statistical monitoring than what you would have expected in many cases. And so here, that's what I'm going to turn to now. So what do we know with strong evidence? Here we've been talking about what governments and the civil society have provided to assure that learning would continue during the school closures and during the COVID. What do we know about the effects and the actual experience of students? So here, that's another report that Williamson and I, colleague Williamson and I have drafted and put together. So one thing very important to keep in mind is that this is something which is only covering the first wave of school closures. So basically what happened in 2020 between March and June, July. And it doesn't include the next school year or the subsequent waves of countries, which is something that we are currently studying. So we have about 5 countries for which we have information on everything, and we have about 7 and 8 other ones for which it is available. But you can see that it is relatively few countries that have monitored what happened very much. So in terms of the experience of remote schooling, well, we know that in most OECD countries, and that during this first wave of school closures, we had 4 to 9 weeks of school closure when you exclude the holiday that were planned. And that the delivery was actually mainly online with much more paper than what you would have expected, so that people were handed worksheets, and that overall you didn't have that many online virtual classes. We know that students studied about half the usual time that they do when they go to school, and also that the teachers have lowered the expectations, and that, and for many of them, the idea was more to stay in touch, and keep the link rather than actually drill the curriculum. We know that parents supported and supervised their children, and especially the younger ones, but they didn't spend that much time on it overall. It's in many cases it's 1 hour or something like that, and that one of the main difficulties that they report is the lack of motivation of the children to actually work. So I talked about the question of engagement, and in some cases, connectivity issues for many of them. What do we know about the outcomes? So here we have covered a lot of different aspects, and I can give you a quick overview. So children reported increased levels of anxiety, stress, loneliness, and boredom. But overall, the parents had more positive view and felt that it went relatively well. Parents had a high level of appreciation for schools, but of course had a bit more concern about the academic progress of their children. And I'm going to talk more about that. There was limited and conflicting evidence on the actually learning outcomes on that. So here you can see, parents are mainly satisfied with how the schools handle things, but they're a bit less satisfied when it comes to whether their children have made academic progress. Even so, this will have a more positive than negative view on that. And we can find the same in different countries. In terms of studies on standardized tests, in many countries, we find little change. So either no change, small decreases, small increases, depending, so there is no coherent picture. In the case of the United States, that's really where we had a big decrease on a very strong study in English, and actually a widening of the gap between Black, African-American, and white students in the state of Ohio. But overall, the first studies that we had were not as dramatic as what you would hear. So here I'm going to show you the French example, where we have the years for 19, 20, and 21, and where actually there was a cut up in 21, slight decrease in 20. In the case here of French reading for year 1 students, you can see in math, it's more or less the same, very small decrease, and then which was caught up in 2021. Year 2, a bit more. So that's interesting, because the impact was not the same for every year. So more decrease in French, but you can see that in math, it is an opposite story, and that actually there was not necessarily so much decrease in that. And for the year 6 students, or the entry of middle school, there was actually a continued growth and increase between 1920 and which continued in 2021 in French and in mathematics. And here you can see the red and the green are the priority education. So students in a school from lower socioeconomic status, and so which in mathematics have several a little bit more, which is not the case in French. So I'm going to skip Germany, and just to mention the equity aspect. What we've seen is really that there was a strong negative impact on disadvantaged populations, especially at home. And that in terms of schooling, that was much more difficult because, the devices, etc. But in fact, all these things can actually, it's not necessarily captured by the achievement gaps that we can see on standardized tests. So it's really more the overall picture that we have that make it clear that this is actually the case. So for example, in the US, much more class constellation, if you came from families from lower circulating background, or if you have a Black alone household, and actually in terms of connectivity, also there is a little bit more suffering. Another aspect is that here I was talking about OECD countries, but in fact, the gap between countries may have increased. So here you can see that in India, 30% of students live engaged, which also means that 70% remain engaged, but the impact on the learning, standardized learning assessments is much stronger than what we can find in OECD countries. And here you can see particularly on the table 5, so people able to read a standard 2 text, which were in the class above, actually decreased from 15% to 9%, between 2014 and 2021, and from 25 to 9 between 2018 and 21. So that this may really have been the impact of it. So as a conclusion, we've done a lot of work, provided we're still in the crisis, and we had different types of principles to do that. But some of the lessons I would like to highlight is first that we had actually a lot of resilience during the crisis, both at the student and at the system level. And we are still in it in some ways, and we're going to see how this continued. We're going to study that, but there was a lot of things that happened. There was a clearly negative and disruptive impact of the school closures, but people managed. There was a lot of inequity, which was exposed and sometimes exacerbated. But that's something that we need to think, not just in terms of academic achievement, but what really happened. And we have to focus on equity and make sure that all these things that we kind of ignored before the crisis are taken care of. But one important point I would like to take away is basically that a lot of innovation has emerged and a lot of ideas, models that can help us to reimagine education differently after the pandemic, and not just recover and go to the old normal, but really see all the things that we've learned to build a much stronger system than what we currently have. So I hope we can work on this internationally, continue to learn from each other, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. I think that we're lucky to have Stefan with us live as well. You can see from his presentation that this is a very large and comprehensive report. And he didn't even get to the lessons and the suggestions for the future that were part of the conclusion of this. But I think it enabled you to see how much we were able to learn from the different countries about exactly what happened and some of the impacts of that. At this time, and again, Stefan, thank you so much for this. What I'd like to do is introduce 2 of our discussants. We are very fortunate to have with us Maria Helena Gomes de Castro from Brazil. Maria is the president of the National Board of Education in Brazil and is also president of the National Association of Educational Evaluation. So she has maintained her interest in education over her lifetime. When I first met Maria, she was the Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo, and I have enjoyed our colleagueship ever since. In addition, we have Alice Amiga, who is a brilliant young leader. She is currently working on her PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she has started a special group that is the African Society there that brings together the young leaders from Africa who are all studying at Cambridge. Her work has been primarily in the study of vocational education and the training aspects of that, both in Ghana, her home country, but also more broadly around the world. So thank you all so much for joining us. And As I said, it's a very comprehensive report, and Stefan, I think, gave us a good overview. I'm going to start with Maria. And Maria, do you have questions for Stefan or comments about the report?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Susan. First, congratulations, Stefan. Your report is impressive, very impressive, because the report is talking about all the aspects since the pandemics began. My question is about inequalities, because in Brazil, the biggest problem is inequalities. We had a system very unequal before pandemics, and now it's worse. We have evidences from research and from assessment that some states are doing, like São Paulo. The figures of São Paulo are unbelievable. We don't have yet the results of INEP. We are waiting for the results of the national large-scale assessment last year. And another point is anxiety, stress, and social emotional skills, because last week we had a terrible problem in Pernambuco. We had in a school, in a public school, in a very poor public school in Pernambuco, in Recife, we had a group of 23 students. At the same time, they began to feel anxiety, stress. They didn't like to stay at school level, and children of 11 and 12 years old, and it was terrible. They had to call ambulance and medical doctors, psychologists, and so on, to take care of children. It was a terrible scene. And now we have a new report from São Paulo, where we see that problems, socioeconomic, social-emotional skills, stress, anxiety, is a very big problem in the state of São Paulo. They have applied a questionnaire and have done a quality research in a sample of schools, and it's very, very complicate the situation of the state of São Paulo. So my questions are looking for the future. What are we going to do to measure inequalities, to measure how inequalities are worst now, and also social emotional skills? Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Stefan, if you'd like to, I mean, we can just do this informally. If you'd like to come off of mute, Stefan, then you can respond to Maria first.
Yes, thank you. So I think that it is indeed one of the major issues that has appeared kind of everywhere, you know, because we know that, well, the fact that, you know, even so there was a lot of things that were provided by different systems. One of the things that happened is that, in fact, for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, the school closures were really a loss of opportunity for them to actually make some progress. We have a very mixed picture depending on countries, and so that's an interesting thing that we need to better understand. Like in the US, for example, the few good studies, a very strong study in Ohio that I've mentioned, you know, shows a really a big widening of inequity and actually a big drop in the learning outcomes. That's true in India, that's true in Brazil, in São Paulo, as you've mentioned. And at the same time, in some other countries, for whatever reason, you know, it hasn't been the case. In terms of the academic achievement of students, what we've seen everywhere is that the students who have struggled to get access to technology, connectivity, that received less service, dropped out the most, etc., come from, you know,
already the groups that were more disadvantaged or were lower performers before. So that indeed, there is a big question mark related to that. And in some ways, in where there was already a very big inequality, in fact, one possible explanation, for the fact that there hasn't been such a great impact on the test scores is that, those students were doing very poorly before and they continue to do very poorly after. And, the ones in other groups were quite resilient, and so it hasn't changed much. Even so, the experience was totally different. And that, they are certain have suffered much more than the others, and so that's really one of the big questions. So what do we do from now is really trying to pay attention to, making sure that those students, get more of the services that what they should have, continue some of the good lessons that we've learned, because like, for example, access to computers, to technology, to resources, there was a lot that was done during the COVID because suddenly people realized that the conditions at home are not the same for everyone, to continue the work. And we need to continue to work on that, rethink what the digital infrastructure that countries should give to schools, students should be, the minimal level of infrastructure that people should get so that you have much less variation. And I believe that's really one of the big questions that many countries are asking themselves.
Yes. Alice, would you like to share any comments or questions that you have?
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Stefan. That was a really very broad and gives a very clear comparative analysis to some of the countries. As I was reading your report and also listening to you, I was looking at the differences again, going back to Maria's comment on inequalities. My concern was really about how families within these disadvantaged communities, backgrounds, parents, how they navigated sort of supporting young people. Especially I myself went to Ghana during field work and it was within the pandemic, and you could clearly see the divide between young people in private schools, whether high-level international private schools, as well as those in the public schools who would usually come from low-income backgrounds. And so did you see sort of clear difference in sort of the support at home, both at the disadvantage level as well as between private schools and public, which is like government schools in other countries? Thank you.
So we have that information for OECD countries, and interestingly, there was actually not too much difference. Well, there was some difference, so we, as you would expect, but not much. In fact, you could see that the parental assistance that students received was more or less the same across the whole socioeconomic gradient or spectrum. And however, which is actually good, because that means that it is parents from all backgrounds paid attention to the learning of their students, and it supported them. And so actually they are big allies for education systems to fight inequities and address that. Of course, now if you ask the question of was the quality the same everywhere of the resources that were given? Probably not, the resources that were, and that's a question. But in terms of the willingness and the engagement in OECD countries where we have information, we find that it was actually relatively similar. Even in India, the study that I've shown, there was not a huge difference in terms of how much people dropped out or were engaging in school activities. And one interesting aspect of it was that there was actually a shift during the COVID. So here, probably for economic reasons, but towards public government schools, because what happened is that people got less money, which is not a nice thing, and so that shifted. And so we'll see how this will go when, in the new normal. One thing we should all keep in mind is that depending on the countries, the time of school closure was very different.
Yeah.
That is very important, because here I've been talking just about the first school closure wave, which was more or less the same everywhere. It was, as I've mentioned, 8 to 9. But if you take into account the next academic year, then in some countries, schools remained closed almost all the time, while in other countries like France that I've highlighted in my presentation, it closed for 1 week only. And that makes a huge difference, obviously, that's...
Yes. And I think that probably the differences between the urban areas and the rural areas in terms of access is very different from suburban middle-class families and homes in terms of what their children had access to, including their parents. Maria, you want to join us?
Yes, Susan, because in Brazilian case, we had an average of 254 days with schools closure. One of the biggest in the world. And in some states, we had 2 years of schools closed. It's the case of Bahia, the case of Paraíba, and many other states of the north. It's not the case of São Paulo and the south. The south, the states of south are different. Well, but anyway, the period, the time of school closure, it had a big impact. You see, because in São Paulo and Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul, in the south, the states had more connectivity, access to connectivity, teacher training, and also good materials to give support to students during the period of school closure. But in the North and Nordeste, we had some cases in Bahia. We had 70 municipalities with 1 year and a half without nothing. Schools closed and nothing happened. Nothing. So it's obviously that inequalities and curriculum is a disaster now, because we are trying to make some flexibility with curriculum. We had a Brazilian Common Core, a national Brazilian Common Core. That's a kind of, let's say, bússola. I don't know how to say the bússola in English. I don't know. Well, but anyway, the Brazilian Common Core is helping states and municipalities to make some flexibility in curriculum, but we think that they will only arrive to the grade before pandemics at the end of 2023 or 24, considering the results of assessment. It's a disaster. Let's see.
Because there is a cumulative effect indeed, of school closure, so that if you are closed for not so long, then you can catch up easily, but if it gets on, then it becomes a very different story. Even if we think of well-being, I mean, one of the countries where there were school closures in the first year, the second year is Germany, and they did a survey asking more or less the same questions. So what you see is that, in fact, the quality of the support, the teaching of learning seems to have improved, so if you look at how the balance of the different types of activities. However, people get fed up. There is a fatigue as well on the family student side, and you can see that in the first wave, while they were saying that, it wasn't ideal, but we've managed. Family relationships remain pretty good. There was even some upsides of being together at that point. If you look at the second wave, 1 year later, then no, it deteriorated, and then they start getting really fed up. So you can imagine when you have such a long period of time of closure, then it becomes a very different kind of picture than, and that will, so one inequality we should think of is really how, and we'll see with studies like PISA, etc. But it's also what it changed in terms of differences across countries, not just within countries, but because the conditions have been very different in different places.
Yes, and I know in many of our cities we're worried that a number of students, in some cases up to 20% of the students, simply have never returned. And the question is, where are they? What are they doing? Have they moved someplace else and simply didn't forward that information, or have they just given up on education? I mean, at this time in our society, dropouts are an enormous problem, because without even the minimal amount of education that our disadvantaged children were receiving in their schools, there is no future. And our countries really are going to have to address that group of students, that group of young adults who have lost the connection, they've lost the interest and the motivation for school, and somehow we have to recapture that. I think.
I agree with you, Suzanne. Yeah,
Yes.
I agree very much, because especially for young women, it was very challenging for some young women to return to school. We already know that in upper secondary school, there is already the higher chances of young women dropping out of school, especially in the global south, where there are lots of cultural sort of challenges, barriers that young women have to sort of cross each time. And so that is a big concern. I would want to know what the data spoke to about that, and where, for instance, were parents more concerned for their young women in secondary school as opposed to boys, and what were the specific strategies available to support, females to especially return back to school, both at the family level or at the macro level in terms of governmental plans.
Yeah, Stefan, I know that OECD is continuing to do studies. Have you looked at some of the issues that we've been raising as future data points for what your reports will show?
Yes, actually the next PISA has a module on COVID, so that we're going to learn a lot about how people experience in different groups, female and boys, girls, and so there will be a lot of information. I think another thing which is interesting on early warning systems, etc., is that so dropout is a big problem everywhere. We know that it's very difficult to keep people engaged when you don't see them. So when you have a remote type of education. But what we have actually noticed during the pandemic is that all the tools that we have against dropout, all the early warning systems, for example, that have been developed on digital, they are all based on whether you are coming to school or not,
Yes.
And I think that's really something that we need to think about, and how we can actually have information also about what's going on outside of school in some ways, so I'm not sure how, but so that we can actually keep people engaged in some ways, or we have tools to see how people can continue to relate, even if they're not physically present in school. But that will be, that's something that no one thought about before, because
right.
In fact, the model was that everyone would go to school, basically. That's
Yes, attendance was the strategy we used. Maria?
Yes. One point in Brazil that I didn't understand why is that enrollment in early childhood education decreased a lot. And very poor people that used to go to creches and early childhood preschool, they abandoned. And of course, those children, they will have difficulties when they enter in the formal school with 6 or 7 years old, because they abandon, and a lot of children abandon early childhood. This will have a big impact in the next future, of course.
Yeah.
So perhaps one reason for that, Maya, I'm not sure whether it would work in Brazil, is that I haven't presented that information, but one way in which people from disadvantaged backgrounds have suffered the most is really economically. First, they were more likely to be exposed to the disease and to have family who are sick. But the second thing is that the parents have also lost their employment, or were put on furlough, or had reduced income to a much greater extent than people from upper class families, in many ways. And so then that may have an impact on whether they, enroll their children in early childhood education facilities or not. That's part of the, so that also has an indirect impact through the economy and the impact of the economy on families.
I think that both Maria and Alice have given you ideas for future studies. And I know that OECD, particularly working with your colleagues at World Bank and Harvard Graduate School of Education and 100 are continuing to study these things. But I wonder whether you have any concluding remarks. Before I ask you that, I would really urge people to get the report. It is available on the OECD website. It is very comprehensive. And as I said, it's not only what happened, but an analysis of that in terms of lessons for the future and ways in which we can strengthen the future education systems that we have. And one of the things that struck me, because at one point I led curriculum development, was the notion that we don't have aligned frameworks that teachers could use when suddenly they were on their own, planning at home rather than at school. And I think that is one of the areas that is critical. But I'm going to let you have some final words, Stefan, on what you think were the critical issues that we all need to be thinking about as we think about future education experiences.
I think one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted is how much more we could involve parents and have them as collaborators in the formal education of their children, and how we can build more on their knowledge, on their capacity to accompany their children in that. So that's really, of course, they've always been a key partner, but here they had to be more than that. And actually, I would say that overall it worked pretty well. And if this could be sustained, that would be very positive. I think a second point that I would take away is how digitalization, the way that we need to embrace digitalization after the COVID, not just to provide resources so that we can get back to before, but that we can learn on all the very different interesting models that were put in place. So think of something that may be more hybrid, where not that you have half of students in one class and half at home, but it's more, how do you use the time and the space in a different way so that you can actually capitalize on what's so important in a place-based school, the social interactions with the peers, the fact that you learn with friends, with the teacher, and things that you can do on your own in some ways, and that we can actually also open up what all the learning is about. Because I think that people have learned a lot during the pandemic, even so they haven't learned a lot academically speaking, perhaps, but that was such an exceptional period of time, that there was a lot of things that they've learned about the community, that they learned about science, how things were changing, about how they've learned about the uncertainty that you have, and they've learned how important it was to see other people and to be part of a community as well. And so I think that we really need to capitalize on that when we're trying to reimagine, and rather than just trying to get back to school as it was before the pandemic, that's so that will be tough, because of course, we want to forget all about this time and just get back to how things were before.
Yes. And of course, many of the students during this period, those that had access to resources, found that their agency in their own learning was very important. They don't want to go back to a place where they're going to listen to lectures, where the teachers are going to control everything they do. Maria, do you have any final comments?
Well, I thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I would like that Vincent began to develop another studies comparing countries or regions that stayed much time with schools closed, because we have to perhaps to try to organize an evaluation of these schools that stayed 1 year closed without nothing, or 2 years closed without nothing with others. In Brazilian case, I think it's very important, but the Minister of Education don't want to do any difference between states and municipalities, but I think we have to, because the future of these students and the future of these schools and teachers is very, very important. We don't know what's going to happen next year. I think that this year is an year of transition. And we are trying at national level to convince states and municipalities that they have to put in place some strategies of transition strategies to begin the curriculum next year in another way. But it's not easy, because it's an electoral year. Everybody thinks only in elections. It's terrible. Thank you very much, but I hope to have another opportunity. Bye-bye.
And Rebecca Maynard, one of our planning committee members, put in a link to an Annenberg-Brown study on research for recovery that they had done. So the link is there if people are interested. Alice, what final comments would you like to make?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And thank you, Maria, for your insightful thoughts on way forward. I think is very key. So for Stefan, I think not too biased, but of course, my focus is on skills development, and there's definitely a connection between the informal and the formal sector. And so I'd probably want to see an update on how young people in vocational schools navigated during COVID, because when I was on field work, those were some of the interesting findings that I saw, that the informal sector provided some sort of learning opportunities for young people, especially skills development and training in the informal sectors. They waited to go back to school or school-based TVET. And so I'd want to know how other countries navigated, what lessons were drawn from that. That would be very interesting to know. Thank you.
I've heard the same concern in the United States about the fewer opportunities for students to get the in-work, in-company experiences that they needed so much if they were going to be well prepared in their vocational program. So thank you all so much. I'd like to mention some upcoming webinars. In May, we're doing the third of these, looking specifically at the United States and whether the experience of some initial testing can give us further information about what worked and what didn't work. And that will be May 17th at 9:30 a.m. But we also have two special programs this month. And on May 3rd, we are co-hosting Beethoven in Beijing, which is a wonderful documentary that was done about the initial visit in 1979 as China was opening of the Philadelphia Philharmonic Orchestra. And then they went back 50 years later, and some of the musicians were kind of catching up with one another and seeing what happened. So we're going to have a film screening and a conversation with the director of Beethoven in Beijing. So if you look for the link on our website, fweforum.org, you'll be able to sign up for the film and in advance of the webinar on the 3rd. The film will become available on the 29th of April, so people have a chance to watch it in advance. That will be at 4:30 p.m. on May 3rd in collaboration with Pace University. We're also having a young leaders webinar, and I think Alice has been a wonderful example of how brilliant our young leaders are at FWE. They're hosting a webinar on May 5th at 9 a.m. on the value and impact of study abroad experiences in fostering their leadership, their passion, and their vision. And I think you saw all three with Alice here. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And that will be May 5th at 9 a.m. So thank you all so much for joining us. I think this is a very important study, and we look forward to your next studies, Stefan, so that we can keep up with who had the most innovative approaches and how all of us can learn. I think one of the things we learned from was, as Maria was talking about the core curriculum, how do we focus that core curriculum on the absolutely critical pieces rather than trying to do it all in the space that we have. So that will be our next one. Thank you all so much. And we look forward to our audience joining us in May.
Bye.